Hi guys, thanks for joining me for today's episode of Blister Prevention Office Hours. Let me just share my screen. Okay, today we are going to be having a look at why blisters are so common, because there is a reason why they continue to be common in spite of them. Everyone thinks that they're just a basic, insignificant injury. Well, if they're so basic and insignificant, why do they continue to be the most common injury in running, sports like netball, walking, and hiking activities? So we're going to look exactly why that is the case. So we'll look at why they're so common, why this matters, and what's needed to address the situation. So the reason blisters continue to be so common is because of this entrenched, and I guess on the surface of it, intuitive paradigm of blister causation, which is heat, moisture, and friction. It's whether you're a podiatrist or not, this is the paradigm we grew up with and that we were taught, and it's hard to sort of see past it. But we're going to see that, in fact, this paradigm is not only incomplete in that it misses the fundamental aspects of blister formation, but it's also quite misunderstood, mainly because of that term friction. We'll look at that in depth. So just to kind of start at the end, we're going to say goodbye to the heat, moisture, friction paradigm, and we're going to say hello to the repetitive shear deformation paradigm. So we're going to get rid of those first three words and we're going to replace it with three new words. I might add that this is not new. We've always known that blisters are an injury of repetitive shear deformation. It's just that the things have been a bit lost in translation as the years have gone by, and I'll get into that a bit more later. Why is it important? Of course, we can only prevent something if we understand what causes it. I mean, if you think of an example like sunburn. So let's say you said sunburn was caused by going outside. Well, yes, it does sometimes, but I can go outside at night and I won't get sunburned. And by the same token, I can be inside next to a sunny window and get sunburned. So staying inside will stop you from getting sunburnt some of the time, if not most of the time, really. But it will mean that you are doing things that you don't need to do. You don't have to always stay inside. You can go outside. Not only can you go outside when the sun's gone down, but you can reduce your sun exposure while you are outside when the sun's up. So yeah, that's just an example of why a proper understanding of cause is really required for effective prevention. So let's have a look at this heat, moisture, friction paradigm and go through each element to see where things are right, where things are wrong, and how we would change it. So together we're going to change this paradigm bit by bit to make it more accurate. So we know that when we've got shoes on, and especially when we're exercising, our feet get hot and sweaty. So yes, they get hot and that creates sweat, which is a form of moisture. But it's important to realize that you don't actually need heat. You can get blisters in very cold environments. And although there is heating of the tissues around where the blister forms, as a lead up to blister formation, it's not causative. So it's an indication of the loads on the skin and soft tissue. But we certainly don't need heat to create blisters. And indeed, blisters are not a thermal injury. So they're not a burn blister. And you don't actually need heat for moisture either, in case you're sort of thinking that's the reason we need heat. You can get wet feet from running through the wet grass or doing a river crossing. But heat and moisture are just about, it's ubiquitous in shoe conditions. It's there basically all the time, but they're not necessarily required for blister formation. We know that moisture increases friction levels. So if you compare to dry, When two things are in contact with one another and they're dry, there's a lower friction force than if there was moisture in between. So yes, that does increase friction. However, what is your understanding of friction in this scenario? 99% of us will have a picture in our mind that it means rubbing. And friction in this situation is not rubbing. The friction in friction blisters is actually the opposite to rubbing. It's the force that resists rubbing. It's the force that resists relative motion. However, most of us are stuck on this idea that friction is rubbing, and that leads us to sticking things on the skin like tape, moleskin, and hydrocolloids and that kind of thing to eliminate the rubbing on the skin. Eliminating rubbing on the skin or adhesive products, they do work to some degree, but not because they stop rubbing. We're going to have a look at that in a minute. So friction is the force that resists relative motion. It's the thing that keeps things stuck together. When there is a movement force. So if friction isn't the movement force, where's the movement coming from that is relevant to blister formation? It's coming from the bones. The bones move within the foot relative to the skin surface as part of every single step that we take. That's quite normal. It's not an abnormal thing. It can happen to excess in some situations, and we can impact on that with stretches and mobilizations and orthotics and biomechanical alterations, heel lifts, all sorts of things. But you can imagine this. We've got three images here of a bone that's at rest and then moves one way and then the other. So you can imagine this as the metatarsal head, for example. So we've got the metatarsal head. The horizontal line is the skin surface, and the angled lines represent soft tissue layers. Of course, they're horizontal, but this just indicates the stretch on them. It's important to understand that in this image, the horizontal line that represents the skin hasn't moved. They are all in alignment. So the skin surface is not moving, but the bone is moving. So when the bone starts to move one way, the force of friction is acting the other way. And remember, friction force is just a force of resistance. It's resisting that bone movement force. The skin isn't actually moving that way, and the skin isn't either moving with the bone necessarily. The bone movement may overcome friction force, and then you will get movement going the other way, but friction is still occurring in the opposite direction. This friction at the skin surface or at any interface is a product of two things. It's a product of the coefficient of friction, which is just a descriptor. It's a dimensionless number that describes the way two materials interact with one another. So just the amount of slipperiness or grippiness between those two materials. So let's say the skin and the sock, they have a certain coefficient of friction. And so friction equals the coefficient of friction times the normal force, which is basically pressure or the compressive force. So friction isn't rubbing. It's a force of resistance. Now, let's just imagine or feel and see what shear looks like. Shear is the soft tissues in between skin and bone stretching and distorting. So if you get one fingertip and place it on the back of your other hand, keep it stuck to that same bit of skin, but move your fingertip back and forth as far as it can go without rubbing, without relative motion. So that's what shear looks like and feels like in the soft tissues on the back of your hand. The harder you press, the bigger the shear. If you press very lightly, you'll see that there's very little shear in the soft tissues on the back of your hand because your finger slips and slides over the skin surface before it can build to any magnitude. So that's how the compressive force or the normal force or the pressure is relevant to friction force. And then if we do this same little experiment and we put some Vaseline on the back of my hand and do the same thing, I would find that I could press very, very hard and my fingertip would slip and slide easily over the back of my hand before shear could build to any degree. So there wouldn't be all that stretching that we see without the Vaseline, even when there's very high pressure. So when we talk about friction, we're talking about both how grippy or slippery things are between two surfaces and the compressive force. They determine friction. So let's have a look at this old paradigm of causation and see about changing it so it's more accurate and helpful. First of all, I get rid of heat and moisture. They're not necessary elements. They're common elements, but they're not necessary. So we'll get rid of that and we will add in bone movement. So bone movement in the presence of high friction force doesn't really equal friction blisters yet. It causes shear deformation. It causes this in the back of your hand, for example. Shear deformation, 1 or 2 episodes of shear deformation isn't going to cause blisters. When it's repetitive, that's what leads to the intraepidermal fatigue within the stratum spinosum. The connections between the cells fatigue and they basically give up the ghost. They snap, the cells die, and that creates a void and fluid fills that area within 2 hours to become a friction blister. So friction and bone movement create the shear deformation, and when that's repetitive, that causes friction blisters. And that is basically our new paradigm of blister causation. It's shear deformation. Repetitive shear deformation creates friction blisters, and the fundamental elements of that are bone movement and high friction force. So let me just explain that in another way. The bones move within the foot, that's completely normal. The skin surface doesn't follow, at least it doesn't follow immediately due to friction force. The soft tissues in between stretch and distort, that's what the shear deformation is. And when this happens too much, there's a tear that develops under the surface of the skin, which is the initial blister injury. Again, why is this important? Because cause has to inform prevention. Without a proper understanding of this, we're going to choose preventions that aren't necessarily as helpful as they should be, but we have an overinflated expectation of their usefulness. And then also we can miss preventive opportunities altogether. Understanding the fundamental elements of repetitive shear deformation opens up previously ignored opportunities for blister prevention and helps identify the strengths and limitations of established preventions. So if we look at this chart that shows all the ways we can prevent blisters, we've looked at friction force, and remember that's a function of the coefficient of friction and pressure. We've looked at the relevance of bone movement, the fundamental relevance of bone movement, and also the importance of repetition in causing the blister injury. There are also other ways we can prevent blisters. We can use materials that absorb shear. So if there's a material that we can place somewhere between the skin and, well, the floor really, but usually between the skin and the shoe, then that material will absorb a bit of shear. It will undergo shear itself. So there's a little bit less that has to happen within the skin and soft tissues. An example would be Spenco RX Comfort insoles, 3mm Spenco insoles. They absorb a bit of shear. Gel toe sleeves do the same thing, even better. We can use materials that spread shear loads. This is how your taping hydrocolloids and moleskin work. They spread shear load over a slightly larger area, or whatever area they take up. So instead of shear being peaking at that bony location, that bony prominence, if we have a big patch of, let's say, moleskin or taping, then shear will be reduced per unit area because we spread it over a larger area, potentially. It's very important to understand that we can train the skin to cope with shear load. That is essentially a familiarity with the footwear and the activity. So when you are just starting out on a new activity, or you've just got new shoes, that's when you're most likely to get blisters. So it's an idea to kind of ease into it gradually. And I'm going to leave you with this thought, and that is rubbing ever part of the problem? Well, it's kind of part of the problem if you think that when we've got a blister, so we've got the intraepidermal fatigue, you certainly do want to stop rubbing on the surface of the skin, because the skin has lost its structural support from underneath. So you must stop that, either with taping, but even better, because you don't really want to stick something to weak skin, because when you take it off, it will take the whole blister roof off. Probably just an island dressing is better. So it is part of the problem once you've actually got the blister injury, even if you don't see the blister yet. But you must understand that promoting rubbing is actually how many preventions work. All of these preventions work by promoting rubbing. They're trying to get the skin to move in sync with the bone at a slightly earlier moment in time. And that includes all of the pressure reduction strategies, so cushioning, donut pads, any biomechanical interventions that you can reduce pressure with. They are, yes, they're reducing pressure, but they work because they're reducing friction force, because friction force is determined by the pressure, the compressive force, plus or times the coefficient of friction. And of course, definitely all of these coefficient of friction strategies, they are all trying to get the skin to move in sync with the bone at an earlier moment. Things like all the moisture management strategies. So they're all trying to get a dry environment, because we know a dry environment has a lower friction level, so there will be slippage sooner. It includes lubricants, Engo patches, double socks, armor skin socks, all of those coefficient of friction reduction strategies. And finally, when we get rubbing, there's two parts to every rub. There's the bit where there's no relative motion, and there's the bit where there is relative motion. So if you do this, you've got, first of all, you've got that where there's no relative motion, and then that where there is relative motion. It's the bit where there is no relative motion that determines peak shear. So if you can get the skin surface moving sooner, you will reduce the magnitude of shear. So it's a bit of a head spin. If you still stuck in the heat moisture friction, with friction meaning rubbing, it's really easy. Well, it's actually really hard to kind of get past that. And it took me a long time. But friction is the force that resists motion, and we're trying to get motion. We're trying to get early motion because we want that bit of skin to move in sync with the bone at an earlier moment. So we've had a look at the old paradigm and why this is the reason why blisters continue to be such a common problem. Because it's incomplete. It doesn't tell us about the important factors, and the bits that it does tell us about, we actually don't even really have a great understanding of. So all in all, this makes us make wrong decisions, or decisions that aren't the best that we can make, because we have an incorrect expectation of certain preventions, and it makes us miss opportunities altogether, like the relevance of bone movement. Outside of podiatry, definitely no one thinks of bone movement. And even within podiatry, even though this is our absolute specialty, biomechanics, most of us don't even think about this in terms of blister creation. So it's a massive opportunity. All right, we've got the Q&A now. So if you've got a question, then feel free to get ready to put your mic on or just type it in the chat and I'll get to it. We've got 2 questions. Anthony asked a great question. He said, how to balance reducing blisters but maintaining friction grip in elite athletes. What Anthony's getting at here is friction isn't bad. And in fact, our foot needs friction for, effective and efficient gait. It needs it for the mechanical efficiencies of gait. Friction, our foot needs traction in our shoe is a better way of saying it. So friction is only a problem where it's a problem. Therefore, you really only need to address it where it's a problem. And the way to do this, Anthony, is to use targeted friction management, or some call it strategic friction management. That is, reduce friction where you've got a blister prone area, reduce it by a lot, and you'll get away with it because you're only reducing it where necessary. You're getting that little patch of skin to move in sync with the bone at an earlier moment. That's what's going to save you from getting blisters. You don't need to reduce friction over the whole foot. I don't think it's a good idea to, like, a lot of people use lubricants that way. They just put it all over their foot and it's all a bit too slippery slidey, but then it will only be slippery slidey until it gets absorbed into the sock and isn't really where we need it to be. And therefore, the longer someone goes with that scenario, they don't actually have low friction level at that point. But definitely at the start, probably within the first hour, hour and a half, things are very, very slippery and it's not ideal. So yeah, you don't really want to reduce friction everywhere. You just want to do it where you need to do it. And that's the beauty of Engo patches. Or if you're using a lubricant, just put it on the area that you need the friction reduction. And with lubricants, reapply it every hour, hour and a half. Or you can use other preventive mechanisms. So remember our preventive mechanisms chart. You can absorb shear. Now be cautious with this one because this also degrades the mechanical efficiencies of gait. And by that I mean if there is give in a material, yes, it saves the skin from undergoing that give, but it actually absorbs propulsive force and braking force. So you really need to match the material to the anatomical location and its functional requirements. For example, a 3 mil Spenco insole under the sole of the foot is appropriate. It absorbs a bit of shear. It doesn't absorb too much. I don't think it's going to have that big an effect on the mechanical efficiencies of a running gait in elite athletes. However, if you think about the gel toe sleeves that we all use, I wouldn't want an insole of that material because there's too much give in it. The shear modulus is too low. There's too much give. The foot loses its stability. Even though there's no relative motion, there's shear going on within the material. You can use tapes and adhesive products to spread that shear load a bit. I often don't use these, but where we're really struggling where we really need to throw the kitchen sink at it, I'll probably add taping. I think most podiatrists fall down by going straight for this and that's it. I think if you start trying to look outside of this mechanism, because tapes don't work by reducing friction. Friction doesn't, so the rubbing isn't the thing that you're trying to stop. So adhering something adhesive to the skin, yes, it will stop rubbing on the skin, but that is not the problem. And reducing bone movement, as we said. I would like to think that in elite athletes, we've already maximized this. This would just be happening as a part of our training regime. This probably isn't quite so helpful because it means not running as much or being active as much, but definitely you can do more than just these mechanisms. And the one that you choose will depend on the anatomical location. You've got to get the best fit for the anatomical location. And if you need help with that, Blister Prevention University is where I outline all of the ins and outs, how preventions work, which anatomical locations benefit most from which preventions and all that kind of stuff. And Aileen and Kieran asked, what are the best socks for prevention? I get asked this just about every episode of Office Hours. We don't, or we know a little bit, but we can't really say for sure. So we know, thanks to the Herring and Ritchie studies, that thick is better than thin. The Herring and Ritchie studies compared cotton and acrylic. So there was one study where they were very thin socks, and then a follow-up study where they were very thick, densely padded socks. When they were thin, the cotton and the acrylic, there was no difference in terms of blister incidence. When they were thick, the acrylic socks helped way, way more than the cotton socks. So there was something about the dense padded thickness of the sock that was preventive of blisters. Was it moisture wicking? Maybe, don't know. Was it just a pure cushioning scenario, reducing the pressure or the compressive force? Or was it that the thick, dense padding of the sock underwent a bit of shear, and that saved the skin and the soft tissues from undergoing a bit of shear? We don't really know, but definitely the thickness was the thing that helped. It's difficult because, number one, no one uses cotton socks in athletic situations now, and there is no such thing as 100% acrylic sock as far as I'm aware. So, but interesting nonetheless. Synthetic versus wool, again, who knows? There's a lot of lab studies to say that the synthetic blends have a moisture wicking effect, but there's nothing that's been done in moist conditions that resemble an in-shoe situation, and certainly nothing that's been done that looks at blister incidence. So it's a bit of an unknown, but what I can tell you is that Doug Ritchie, who probably knows the most about socks, he's lived and breathed socks for many years. He has an inkling that wool is probably better, and in that the absorptive capacity or the moisture management function of any sock in an enclosed shoe can only do so much because of that humid in-shoe environment. So the absorptive capacity is kind of overcome at some point, and it just can't do anymore. Wool has the potential to actually absorb moisture within the fibers. But yeah, we're just guessing, but it's an educated guess from Doug, and I would kind of take notice of that if I was trying to steer my patients in the way of one sock or another. To me, really, though, in the long run, I say it comes down to preference. Just try a bunch of socks. I know it's not ideal. We like to think that we know. We'd like to look like we know, but we don't actually know. And finally, single versus double socks. The jury's out on that. We've had 3 studies. One found that 2 double socks work better than a single sock scenario. Another one found that one of the double sock scenarios worked, but the other double sock scenario didn't. And another study found that the single sock worked better than the double socks. It's hard to really hang your hat on that, though, because the socks were so different in terms of composition, thickness, etc. So we can't really hang our hat on that either, which is a shame. And finally, Kieran asked about taping. And Kieran, I saw that you took the free CPD course, which was a webinar recording all about the ins and outs of taping. So I'm sure that that's answered your questions. Okay, so that's it from me. Are there any questions that you guys have in the chat? Nothing there at the moment. Wow, that took longer than I thought. Right on 30 minutes. All right, people, I'll bid you farewell. Thank you for joining me today. If you've got any questions, let me know. I'll be here the first Wednesday of September, and we're going to be talking about shear band at this stage, how to apply it, why it works, how it works, all that kind of thing. So if you need to watch the recording, jump over onto pro.blister-prevention.com. That's where we keep the recordings, and I shall see you next time. Thank you. Bye for now.